Nights in a medieval castle are not romance and fairy tales, but cold, darkness, and constant danger from which there is no escape. Behind the massive stone walls hid not cozy bedrooms, but icy halls where every sound could portend trouble and every movement a signal of alarm. Who could sleep well when winter raged outside the window and fear of attack, disease, and the unknown settled inside? How did people living in such conditions find the strength to survive this harsh night? This mystery still stirs the minds of historians and lovers of the Middle Ages. It is interesting to know what was the real face of the night behind the fortress walls. Inside these stone giants, the darkness and dampness were impenetrable, and the faint light of torches barely dispersed the shadows that hid not only fears but real threats. The icy cold penetrated the walls, and only the rare hearths that barely warmed the air gave at least a ghostly sense of warmth. Dense curtains and heavy oak doors could not fully protect from the penetrating wind and drafts, and the soldiers and servants on duty in the castle had no right to sleep better. Every minute was filled with tension and expectation of danger. For them, the night was a time of unceasing vigilance, and for the nobles, it was a test of fortitude and courage. The stone walls of medieval castles, sometimes reaching several meters in thickness, on the one hand served as a reliable defense against enemies, but on the other hand they became real traps for cold and dampness, penetrating into every crack and pore. Despite its massiveness, the stone perfectly conducted the cold, and frosty winds, penetrating the narrow loopholes and cracks, turned the interior of the castle into icy chambers, where even breathing turned into vapor. During the winter months, the temperature in castles could drop to several degrees above zero, sometimes even lower, because central heating did not exist, and open hearths rarely provided even heat. People tried to fight the cold with improvised means. Walls were covered with heavy fabrics, such as woolen tapestries and linen, to reduce wind flow and insulation, and the floor was covered with mattresses and animal skins to try to keep the heat underfoot. In the wealthy castles of the nobility, expensive carpets and rugs made of wool were used, which partially saved them from the cold. But for most castle dwellers, such luxuries were unaffordable, and they had to endure the icy cold with minimal protection. Heavy oak doors often did not close tightly, letting in drafts, and narrow windows, protected only by wooden shutters or thin parchment, allowed the frost to penetrate inside like an invisible enemy. In some parts of Europe, especially in the northern and mountainous regions where winters were particularly harsh, castles could remain cold even in areas where temperatures outside dropped to -20 or below, and it was not uncommon to see a thin layer of frost on stone surfaces and wooden furniture inside. Archaeological research and chronicle records from the 14th through 15th centuries confirmed that, even in the main halls of castles, the air was barely warmer than the street, and people often wrapped themselves in hides and heavy cloaks to somehow protect themselves from the icy breath of the walls. To increase insulation, primitive wooden partitions were sometimes built in poor rooms, and doorways were covered with cloth to reduce the space available for heating, thus preserving some heat from the weak fire. Tufts filled with dry grass were ubiquitous as bedding on the cold stone floor and were regularly renewed to prevent dampness, for dampness aggravated the feeling of cold and provoked disease. Folk chronicles describe how castle dwellers, especially servants and soldiers, used animal skins, often untreated with fur inside to keep warm while resisting moisture and cold air. Sometimes, for additional insulation, temporary wooden structures were built inside the main halls, peculiar cabins or booths where the inhabitants could take shelter, concentrating the heat from fire and body heat around them as much as possible. But even these measures could not completely eliminate the constant feeling of cold that permeated the entire castle space. Unfortunately, historical chronicles and diaries of those times remind that many medieval people suffered from constant colds and illnesses caused by the icy dampness of the castle walls. And often in winter, it was the cold that became stronger than any threat from enemies. So while the thick walls provided security, they also created conditions in which the struggle for warmth was a daily and arduous one, a real test of the body and spirit of everyone who slept in these stone fortresses. In a medieval castle, sleeping conditions were strictly divided according to the social status of the inhabitants, and this division determined not only the level of comfort, but also the chances of survival on a cold and gloomy night. The lord and his family usually occupied separate chambers or small rooms near the main hall, where there was a large fireplace, the only source of heat that could warm the room at least a little. But even there, the temperature rarely rose above cool, and sometimes it seemed that even a burning fire could not banish all the dampness and icy cold of the stone walls. In these rooms, one could find wooden beds with straw mattresses and coarse cloths, often covered with woolen plaids, which at least partially protected from the cold, but did not eliminate the need to wrap oneself in hides and heavy clothes even at night. For servants, guards, and the less privileged inhabitants of the castle, sleeping quarters were spacious common halls where one sought rest on long wooden benches or simply on straw mats on the floor. These rooms were seldom heated. The fireplace was usually insufficient to heat the whole room, and the fire was often kept only for cooking or lighting, so that at night the cold and damp reigned almost unchallenged. It was not uncommon for dozens of people to sleep in such halls at the same time, which allowed for some warmth due to proximity to each other, but at the same time created many inconveniences: noise, cramped quarters, and most importantly, lack of privacy. Given the harsh conditions, sleep in such places was intermittent and shallow. People had to be awake and alert. Social hierarchy affected everything from who could afford a few hours of sleep by the fireplace, to the quality of the bed, and even the amount of clothing that could be removed for the night. Lords and nobles often had servants to make them warm drinks, adjust their blankets, and keep them in order, while peasants and servants had to deal with the cold and discomfort themselves, with neither soft blankets nor caring hands. Moreover, at night, the responsibility for the castle's security fell precisely on the shoulders of the soldiers and guards, who could not afford to rest fully. Constant duty and fear of a sudden attack kept them awake. Sometimes lords would set up separate rooms for guests or high-ranking visitors, with better fabrics and slightly thicker mattresses. But even there, the night was spent in suspense because of the cold and the threat that always loomed over the castle. Archaeological finds such as remnants of fabrics, straw mattresses, and the remains of hearths confirm that medieval bedrooms were not warm havens. Rather, they were temporary shelters where everyone had to be prepared for any challenge. Diaries and chronicles of those times often contained descriptions of the nightly sufferings and difficulties associated with insomnia, cold, and constant fear. Gradually, by the late Middle Ages, wealthy castles began to use more sophisticated ways of insulating rooms. Heavy curtains on doors and windows, decorative carpets, and even stoves. But this remained the prerogative of the upper classes only. At the same time, commoners remained hostage to cold and damp halls, where the only consolation was their common endurance and habit of hardship. Thus, the sleeping quarters of a medieval castle reflected the social structure of the time. Comfort and warmth were privileges that separated the ruling from the servants. And in this rigid hierarchy, each night was a test to be passed with strength and spirit. A medieval castle at night was not only an icy and cold space, but also a deep darkness that had to be illuminated by improvised and far from ideal means, such as torches, oil lamps, and tar wicks. Corridors and chambers were rarely evenly lit. The bright but short-lived torches were more for moving from one room to another than for comfort, as bright flames burned out quickly and were extremely difficult to obtain and maintain. Lamp oil, most often animal tallow or vegetable oils, was an expensive and limited resource, so lamps had to be lit sparingly and often only in the main halls or lords' rooms. Wooden or metal candlesticks hung on the walls, but the number of candles was strictly limited, and bright light at night was a rarity rather than the rule. For corridors, where some visibility was often required, tar torches made of resin-soaked twigs were used, which burned long and brightly but smoked heavily, filling the air with soot and acrid odor. Such lighting was not only inconvenient, but also dangerous. The proximity of the fire to the wooden floors and fabrics of the castle meant that the risk of fire remained a constant threat, from which even thick stone walls were not safe. Historical chronicles and archaeological finds show that castle fires were not uncommon, often starting at night because of unlit or fallen torches, and they often caused widespread destruction. This forced the inhabitants to be extremely careful with fire, controlling every lit candle or torch, and sometimes even forbidding the use of open flames at night. The technical limitations in lighting were enormous. There were no dimmable or safe lamps, and oils and candles were produced in limited quantities, making light a luxury available only to a select few. Even in wealthy castles, the number of candles per person was minimal, and sometimes night vigils were held in semi-darkness or total darkness, increasing stress and fear among the inhabitants. The servants in charge of keeping the fire going often carried torches or lamps, moving from room to room to check on the guards. But even their illumination was very localized and did not provide a full view of the surrounding space. With limited light, it was difficult to maintain order or control access to important rooms, making the nights not only cold, but also dangerous. Moreover, the lack of stable lighting created favorable conditions for clandestine meetings, intrigue, and theft, increasing tension and mistrust among castle dwellers. This eternal balance between the need to see and the danger of fire made medieval nights unbearably tense, and every light source a precious and carefully guarded resource. Historians note that in the late Middle Ages, experiments began to improve the quality of lighting. The first more efficient beeswax candles appeared, and even special glass lanterns were used, but even then the illumination remained weak and uneven. Despite all efforts, the reality was harsh. Night in a castle is above all darkness and cold, and light only dispersed the gloom for a short time and in a very limited space. Lighting was a symbol of safety, but it also brought with it risks, and it had to be managed with extreme care. Thus, light in a medieval castle was both a salvation and a threat, a rare comfort and a constant challenge, emphasizing the fragility of life and the greatness of human resilience in the midst of nighttime gloom and cold. The night in a medieval castle was rarely quiet and peaceful. Instead, it was filled with a multitude of sounds that inevitably caused anxiety and fear in the inhabitants. The creaks of the wooden floors and floorboards were intensified by the cold and settled deeper into the mind, making one listen to every rustle as if expecting trouble. The wind howling through the narrow window openings and loopholes made it seem as if the walls themselves were groaning from an invisible force, and this ominous noise often prevented one from recognizing the real sounds of danger outside the castle. Beyond the walls were the echoes of nocturnal animals, wolves, owls, and foxes, whose shrill cries added a mystical menace to the nocturnal atmosphere and kept the guards on their toes. Night was never a time of peace, as it hid constant danger, whether it was an attack by enemy troops, raids by brigands, or sudden internal conflicts among the castle's inhabitants. Historical chronicles often mention the alarms and battle cries that sounded in the night when sentries noticed suspicious movements outside the walls and raised the alarm. These alarm sounds became a signal for the entire castle. Men grabbed their weapons, women hid in hiding places, and children huddled in dark corners in fear. Night attacks were frequent and brutal, for the enemy realized that in the darkness, it was easier to break through and strike unexpectedly. Real cases of such attacks are recorded in many medieval chronicles. For example, the sieges of French castles during the 100 Years' War were accompanied not only by artillery fire during the day, but also by frequent night raids when small units tried to sneak in, using darkness as an ally. Under such conditions, each night became a test of endurance, requiring the defenders to be extremely focused and ready for instant action. Even rumors of possible conspiracies or internal treachery could cause nighttime alarms, with the sounds of footsteps and whispers inside the castle becoming a source of suspicion and fear. In addition, the sounds of night emphasized the isolation of the castle from the outside world, with only the echoes of nature and the muffled voices of sentries wandering the stone corridors to ward off darkness and fear. Many inhabitants of the castle tried to drown out the disturbing sounds with prayers or quiet conversations, trying to keep the mind from harmful thoughts because the night could drag on for long hours and even days during siege periods. Thus, the sound of the night, creaks, wind howls, animal cries, distant voices and alarms, became a constant companion that required not only physical, but also psychological fortitude. Historians note that medieval people's perception of the sounds of the night was much more acute than that of modern people, because the life of an entire community depended on their reaction, and every sound could be a harbinger of disaster or salvation. In this context, the night was not just a time of rest, but an active time of struggle, of constant alertness and inner struggle with fears and the unknown, making every heartbeat to the rhythm of inexorable anxiety and expectation. In a medieval castle, guarding at night was not just a formality, but a vital task on which the safety of the entire community depended. Patrolling the walls and courtyards were specially appointed warriors, guards and watchmen, clad in heavy armor and armed with spears, swords, or crossbows. They were ready to meet any threat that might arise in the darkness. These patrols kept their watch on a strict schedule, rotating by the hour so that fatigue would not weaken their vigilance, and each warrior knew that carelessness on such an important night could cost not only his life, but everyone around him. An important part of the night's service was the ritual of the changing of the guard. The old warrior would approach his replacement, handing him the keys to the gate and the watch signs, and briefly reporting on what had happened in the previous hour, be it suspicious sounds or movements. The responsibility for the gates was especially great, for it was through them that enemies or brigands could enter, and it was the watchman at the gates who had to scrutinize everyone who tried to pass, even in the dead of night. The internal order of the castle was maintained just as strictly. Patrols checked cellars, kitchens, and warehouses to prevent arson or sabotage by traitors. Night patrols were often armed not only with swords, but also with alarm bells, which allowed them to quickly raise the alarm if there was a disturbance. Historical chronicles tell us that in the major castles of Europe, such as Edinburgh or Carcassonne, the guards worked according to very precise rules passed down from generation to generation, and there were even special songs and shouts by which the guards informed each other of their location and the state of the post. Morale was also an important aspect. Patrolling at night was physically and psychologically demanding, and many guards used prayers, short stories, and even simple jokes to keep fear from taking over. Sometimes the guards would cross paths with the castle's nocturnal inhabitants, servants or military personnel hurrying about their business, and in these cases, instant identification was required to prevent mistakes and accidental incidents. Guarding a castle at night was often the last line of defense during sieges, when enemies tried to break through in the dark hours, counting on the fatigue and inattention of the guards. Archaeological finds show that many castles were equipped with specially equipped posts and watchtowers, where watchmen could see far into the darkness and react quickly to approaching enemy units. Several medieval documents detail the fines and punishments for failure to perform duties during night watch, up to and including the death penalty, which emphasized the seriousness and responsibility of the job. Thus, night guarding in a medieval castle was not just a formal process, but a key element of security that required people to be as focused, disciplined, and ready for instant action as possible, because the lives of many and the fate of the castle itself depended on it. In the darkness, where every sound could be a sign of danger, these sentries were the eyes and ears of the castle, and their vigilance sometimes saved lives and kept the peace for weeks and months. Night watches in a medieval castle are rarely associated with the notion of comfort, and hygiene in this period was far from the standards we have come to think of as the norm today. Night pots, simple containers of ceramic or metal, were an integral part of the inhabitants' lives, and their use was often accompanied by embarrassment and unpleasant odors, especially in cramped and poorly ventilated rooms. The lack of modern sanitation systems meant that pots were not often taken out, and when it came to lookout loopholes or small windows through which waste was sometimes thrown, this caused additional difficulties. The castle was often in the center of the settlement, and odors could spread throughout the area. Privacy in such conditions was almost unattainable. Many rooms served as both bedrooms and workspaces, and the dense social hierarchy left little room for privacy. Odors and dirt were constant companions of castle life, and the inhabitants tried to mask them with aromatic herbs, burnt sandalwood sticks, or simply fire. But often these measures only temporarily improved the situation without eliminating the root causes. Special attention was paid to keeping the corridors and halls clean, where not only people but also animals, horses, dogs, and even pigs would congregate and contribute to the accumulation of dirt and debris. Sand and wood chips were spread on the floor to absorb moisture and make cleaning easier, and smoke treatments with herbs were used to get rid of insects. But even this was only a half measure. Historical documents and archaeological finds testify that in rich castles, there were separate rooms, so-called toilets, where waste was discharged into special ditches or wells. But such conveniences were not available to everyone. Simple servants and craftsmen often used to defecate right in the corners of the rooms or in the yard. The darkness of the night added to all these inconveniences. Traveling up stone stairs and narrow passages with a pot in hand required caution not to fall and spill the contents. In addition, the lack of windows in the dormitories meant that the air was often stale and damp, contributing to the spread of disease and infection. Rarely shown in the movies, everyday details such as the need to sleep in clothes to keep warm or the use of various fabric scraps and straw mattresses helped to improve the quality of the night's rest, but did not eliminate the main problems. Often castles were cramped. Several people shared a room, and the night passed under the noise of creaking floorboards, the stomping of animals and the chatter of guards, and the need to get up at night for various needs became a real ordeal. Even the noble lords, surrounded by luxury, were not immune to these inconveniences. Cold, damp, and unpleasant odors were present everywhere, despite numerous attempts to create comfort. Women and children tended to stay close to the fire to keep warm, and men, busy with guarding and defending, slept in armor or with weapons at hand, which was also not conducive to relaxation and a good night's sleep. Interestingly, some regions use salt and charcoal to neutralize odors, as well as special infusions of herbs with antiseptic properties. Such knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and was part of folk medicine. However, even the most elaborate methods could not completely eliminate the discomfort that accompanied every medieval night in the castle. Thus, nocturnal hygiene and comfort were more a matter of survival and habit than of pleasant leisure. And it was these everyday details that created the atmosphere of a real medieval night. Far from romanticized images and full of the realities of a harsh, difficult life. In the darkness, where every sound could disturb the delicate balance, people struggled with their own weakness and circumstances, trying to preserve their health and strength for the new day, which brought its own challenges. In a medieval castle, night was often perceived as a time when the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of spirits became especially thin, and fear of invisible forces forced people to resort to various rites and protective rituals designed to protect them from harm and misfortune. Before going to bed, lords, servants, and even children were obliged to say prayers. Not only traditional Christian prayers, but also special intercessory appeals to the saints, to whom the power to ward off evil spirits and demons roaming in the dark was attributed. In addition to prayers, various amulets were placed under the pillows, most often crosses, threads with knots, dried herbs, or even small icons, which, according to the belief, could protect the sleeper from nightmares and attacks of evil spirits. Medieval people lived in constant fear of witches and sorcerers, whose abilities, according to legends, were enhanced at night, when they could supposedly penetrate homes and influence the fate of the inhabitants. Belief in the spirits and demons of the night was so strong that garlic, sacred symbols, and incantations were hung all over the castle to disgust or scare away evil forces. Many of the castle's inhabitants strictly observed night rituals, from the special consecration of room corners to small acts like sprinkling salt on the threshold. This element was a symbol of protection and the boundary between light and darkness. Written documents from monasteries and chronicles often mention instances when lords ordered special night prayers in the castle chapels, especially in times of calamity and war, in order to gain the protection of higher powers. One of the most famous texts of those times are the prayers from the Evil One, which were heard not only in churches, but also in private chambers, where people sought comfort and protection from night fears. These prayers were often accompanied by a conspiracy, where words and gestures were combined into a single ritual. For example, crossing oneself 3 times, calling the names of saints 3 times, and saying a special incantation to enhance the effect. Often older women, who knew ancient herbs and beliefs, prepared special infusions and ointments of wormwood, lavender, and juniper, which they kept near the bed, believing that their smell would scare away evil forces. Such traditions were passed down from generation to generation, becoming an integral part of the life of everyone who lived behind the stone walls. Historical sources confirm that medieval castles often became the arena for fighting not only real enemies, but also invisible ones, for it was at night that the most disturbing scenes of spiritual confrontation were played out. One of the surviving chronicles describes a case when, during a long siege, the defenders of a castle organized special night services and prayer services to prevent fear and superstition from destroying morale. These rituals helped people maintain the inner calm that was so necessary in the face of constant threat and isolation. Understanding the importance of spiritual defense of the night shows that survival in a medieval castle was not only a matter of physical fortitude, but also of deep psychological and cultural practices. Thus, night rituals and protection from evil were an integral part of the daily life of castle dwellers, helping them to cope with unknown fears and maintain faith in light and justice even in the darkest hours. These rituals, a mixture of religious practices, folk beliefs, and magical actions, reflect medieval man's complex relationship to a world in which the living and the dead, good and evil, constantly coexisted on the edge of the visible and the invisible. Each of the castle's inhabitants, from lord to servant, participated in these nighttime defenses because they were the thin shield that allowed them to survive not only the cold and darkness, but also the fear generated by the unknown. Nights in a medieval castle were rarely a time of peace and rest, for many of the inhabitants suffered from chronic illnesses, and the cold and damp only aggravated their condition, making sleep an endless struggle to regain some measure of strength. In the castle chambers, where the walls let in icy air and ventilation was minimal, humidity sometimes reached such levels that clothes and bedding quickly became wet, creating the perfect environment for the spread of colds and respiratory ailments. Chronic coughs, shortness of breath, and fever became almost the norm, especially for those who could not warm themselves by the fireplace or had to sleep on damp straw without damp bedding. Many sources from the 15th and 16th centuries record numerous epidemics and cases of fatal colds during the winter months, when the nights were coldest and dampest. The lack of effective medicines and understanding of the causes of illnesses forced people to rely on folk remedies, herbal infusions, hot compresses, and prayers. But these measures only partially alleviated suffering and could not completely eliminate nighttime torment. Sleep became restless not only because of physical discomfort, but also because of the constant fear of deteriorating health and the inability to get help at any time of the day. Often coughs and wheezes echoed throughout the castle, disturbing the peace of all the inhabitants, and many a night was spent in anxious waiting, not knowing whether relief would come with the first rays of the sun. The elderly, children, and the sick had a particularly hard time, becoming hostages to their own bodies, which gave neither rest nor peace, turning the night into a series of painful awakenings and impotent attempts to sleep again. Historical chronicles show that even lords and knights, surrounded by the care of servants and healers, often suffered from pneumonia and tuberculosis, diseases that were often fatal in castle conditions. The cramped and crowded conditions, where several generations lived in one large hall or next to each other, contributed to the rapid spread of infections, and castle physicians faced limited options for treating and isolating the sick. The air inside the castle was often filled with the smells of burning torches, soot, and damp mold, which only exacerbated respiratory problems. There was also the added psychological burden, the constant fear of death and the unknown, the moans and coughs of relatives or roommates heard in the night. All this made the night a trying time for anyone. Anecdotal records of medieval physicians and alchemists show that the fight against disease involved elaborate rituals and treatments using herbs and minerals, but success was minimal, and death was often seen as an inevitable outcome, especially during the colder months. The castle chambers became places of not only physical, but also emotional suffering, where sleep was not a rest, but a necessity for sustenance that was difficult to achieve. The severity of illness was felt in every creak of the floor and every breath, and many left this world in the night hours, when help was far away and fear and cold were near. Thus, the night in a medieval castle was not only a time of darkness and cold, but also a time of constant struggle with disease and physical exhaustion, when sleep became a rare and troublesome guest, and survival depended on the strength of spirit and the resilience of the body, often deprived of even minimal care and attention. This difficult aspect of medieval life is rarely reflected in popular culture, but it shows the true face of those nights, full of pain, fear, and the relentless struggle for life. The night in a medieval castle was a time of special danger, when any unexpected movement or sound could be the beginning of a real disaster, a siege, an attack, or a raid, and therefore all the inhabitants, from lord to servants, lived in constant readiness for possible trouble, which could come suddenly and without warning. The garrison of the castle was divided into night shifts. Sentries and guards constantly patrolled the walls and courtyards, listening carefully to the sounds, catching the slightest signs of approaching enemies. And the most experienced fighters, and from the very beginning of the night, took places at the gates and in the towers, armed to the teeth. In case of alarm, a bell or a battle drum was rung, the sound of which echoed throughout the castle, instantly waking up even the sleepiest inhabitants, reminding them that the time of sleep was over and it was time to prepare for defense. In those moments, real panic broke out, but within strictly regulated limits. Servants carried weapons to the lords and knights, the garrison gathered at the main gate, and women and children hid in the most secure rooms of the castle, where they could take refuge and hope for protection. Historical chronicles describe night attacks in great detail, such as the siege of the castle of Crecy in the 14th century, when the English endured several hours of brutal clashes in total darkness, fighting in smoke and damp, while the power of torchlight and the sounds of battle created an eerie atmosphere of terror and chaos. Often, night attacks took advantage of the surprise effect. Spies and scouts would try to sneak inside the fortress to open the gates for the main army, or they would set up dug-ins, hiding in the darkness until the first light shattered their illusions of safety. The people who lived in the castle knew that night was a time of double danger. Outside, there could always be a threat, and inside, the very fears and tensions could lead to mistakes that cost lives. In times of alarm, the walls were filled with the sound of loud commands, the clinking of fighters, the clanking of weapons and tense prayers, leaving no room for peace even after the threat had passed. The sentries had to not only monitor the outer perimeter, but also control internal order. Any sign of panic or rebellion could lead to the collapse of the defenses, and therefore strict discipline was a necessary element of survival. Historical records show that some castles were besieged for weeks and sometimes months, with nights becoming a constant test of endurance and mental fortitude, where every sound could signal a new battle. Remembering the night attacks, one cannot but note that even the strongest wall and a well-trained garrison did not guarantee peace of mind. In such conditions, victory depended not only on weapons and numbers, but also on the ability to keep cool, make quick decisions, and maintain morale in the face of constant threat. As a result, each night could become a real test for the castle's inhabitants, fighting not only external enemies, but also internal fears and fatigue, and historical chronicles serve as a living reminder of how harsh and uncompromising those times were. It was these nighttime anxieties that became the moments when medieval man showed real fortitude and courage, from which the legend of medieval chivalry and castle life was formed. Even the darkest and coldest nights spent inside the massive stone walls of a medieval castle were often perceived as safer and more predictable than the harsh and unpredictable life outside. For the outside world presented constant dangers, from violent weather conditions to brigands, wild beasts and hungry vagabonds that kept them at bay day and night. For those who did not have the opportunity or status to take shelter behind stone bastions, the night in the open was a real ordeal, and travelers, peasants, and hermits, often forced to sleep in forests, fields, or on hills, faced cold, damp attacks by wild animals and bandits without even basic protection against natural and human threats. That is why the castle, although it seemed uncomfortable and harsh, with its cold halls, scanty lighting, and creaky doors, was still a symbol of relative safety, guaranteeing protection and shelter, which in the medieval world was crucial for survival. Historical chronicles describe how castle dwellers, even in the most difficult times, could rely on the protection of guards, organized supplies and food supplies, and walls capable of repelling raids and attacks, while peasants living in huts and villages often fell victim to night raids and bandits. Many hermits who chose a secluded life in the forests experienced the brutality of the wilderness. Cold winds, torrential rains, and nocturnal predators became a constant challenge, and their nights were often filled with fear and a struggle to stay alive. Even the monks, hermits, and pilgrims who wandered between towns and villages often slept in shelters with minimal or no facilities under the stars, where any noise or movement could mean danger. Despite all the inconveniences that accompanied life in a castle, drafts, cold, not always comfortable sleeping quarters, and constant fear of internal and external dangers, the walls of the fortress created a barrier that allowed them to concentrate on keeping life in order inside, while providing at least minimal protection from the chaos and violence that raged outside. Castles, with their complex system of fortifications, watchtowers, and sentries, were not just dwellings, but living defense mechanisms in which each night could be a rigorous examination, but also gave a sense of belonging to something larger, a community, a lord, a land. This sense of belonging and security sustained the morale of the inhabitants, enabled them to withstand constant hardship, and served as an essential survival factor in the difficult times of the Middle Ages. There are historical cases when castle communities withstood months-long sieges, eating supplies and using strategic knowledge, while outside the walls, many settlements disappeared under the onslaught of enemies and famine. And it is these facts that emphasize the importance of the castle as a stronghold of security, despite all the inconveniences of inner life. Ultimately, even the worst night inside the castle walls was a reminder to the medieval man that he was at least partially protected, while outside the walls reigned the element of dangers that could destroy everything. This comparison of the inner and outer world makes us look at medieval life in a new way, realize the price people paid for security and comfort, and understand why the castle was perceived not only as a dwelling, but also as a vital shelter, a boundary between life and death, between chaos and order. Nights in medieval castles were full of challenges, where every moment could be decisive in the fight for life and safety. Cold penetrated the stone walls, fear made hearts beat harder, and courage and endurance created true heroes of their time. Today, as we look back, we realize how strong and resilient these people were, and what lessons they left us with. Lessons of resilience, survival, and faith in the best. If you are fascinated by the mysteries of the past and want to learn more about how our ancestors lived and survived, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new exciting stories. Together, we will open the doors to an era where every moment was a challenge and every morning was a small victory. Subscribe and let the past inspire you to new accomplishments today.